Hamas, specifically its political arm, is facing a crisis, and not just the one that began when its military wing spilled over the blockade on October 7th. Whether you are a leader in an autocracy or a democracy, public popularity is critical if you want to stay in office. The reason is straightforward in democracies. You have to win elections to remain in power. Autocracies are more complicated, but the more that people like you, the less likely you are to face mobs marching on the streets to remove you, and the less you have to empower your security forces, which also makes it less likely you will face coup threats from those security forces. With that in mind, however you want to classify the governance institutions in Gaza, popularity was a problem, and some newly released data show exactly where Hamas stood on the eve of conflict. As you might guess, the numbers are not so hot. That is why today we are going to go into the brief history of Hamas as a political actor, take a deeper dive into what those data say, a couple of caveats about the findings, one of which is perversely amusing, and how the survey helps us understand what may have caused the October 7th attack, both as a standard diversionary story and as an attempt to provoke Israel into an overreaction. But we begin with the weird politics inside of Gaza, and apologies in advance for simplifying a complex history into 3 quick minutes. Hamas formed in the late 1980s, evolving from a pre-existing charity organization. But the move to militancy meant less attention paid to building libraries, and more attention paid toward coercion against Israel, leading to many states over time, particularly those that partner with Israel, to designate it as one might expect. The group sat out a Palestinian election in 1996, and repeated that move in 2005. However, the next election occurred the following year, and by then Hamas had officially expanded into the political sphere. Such a charity, militancy, political party nexus is actually very common in places with weak rule of law. Charity helps grow grassroots popularity, which is important for both picking up the votes and recruiting foot soldiers. And at the risk of quoting someone who has been dead for almost 2 centuries, war is politics by other means. It is just a question of how much effort you want to spend in one bucket versus the other. 2006 was a fateful year, though, because Hamas won the election. Very quickly, however, its leadership learned firsthand that winning an election is not the same thing as getting people to follow the results of an election. That 2006 election covered both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Hamas's military power resided in the Gaza Strip, while its main rival Fatah had better status quo control over the West Bank. To make matters more difficult for Hamas, Israel, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Western countries more broadly sided with Fatah, and the vote itself was far from being a blowout. Facing these pressures, Hamas met with Fatah in Mecca to negotiate a unity government. Saudi Arabia mediated, and probably tried desperately to convince YouTube commenters that their flag was distinct. Different color, and they have a sword. Anyway, Israel said that it would still only deal with Fatah leadership. The result was the Battle of Gaza, where Hamas expelled Fatah from the Strip, and Israel and Egypt solidified the blockade around it. More than 17 years of very turbulent economic times have passed since then, but there have not been any further elections, which is perhaps not surprising given the geographic fracturing between the two of them. Thus, we have this weird world where Hamas derives its governing legitimacy through elections, even though a majority of Gazans have no memories of an election. Seriously, the population pyramid for Gaza is pretty crazy. And at the same time, Hamas is still a militant organization, so maintaining power in Gaza is also a function of that. If this is causing your head to hurt as much as it is mine, here is your aspirin in the form of a summary. Hamas governs more than 2 million people. There are direct and obvious rivals to its leadership. And to maintain the throne, It cannot completely lose the support of those that it governs. But what does that popularity look like? Miraculously, we have lucked into a pretty good answer to that question. It is all thanks to an organization known as Arab Barometer. As a political scientist, it is hard to escape the fill-in-the-blank barometers. We have the Afro, Euro, Asian, and the fully translated Latino Barometro. Yes, we political scientists really love our barometers. These groups are the standard bearers of survey data of the geographic prefix in front of the barometer part. Arab Barometer, in particular, is a joint project between Princeton University and the University of Michigan. Yep, that's right. I know this is hard to believe, but Michigan does research on more than just opposing sidelines. Allegedly, of course. Regardless, per their standard wave of surveys, Arab Barometer just so happened to be on the ground in Gaza and asking Palestinians their thoughts about Hamas, beginning on September 28, 2023, and ending on October 6th. Purely coincidentally, the attack on Israel occurred the very next day. That means we have a clear snapshot in time of Gazan preferences before the attack, and before Israel's subsequent response perhaps changed perceptions. The headline finding? 67% of Gazans, a two-thirds supermajority, lacked faith in Hamas. In particular, 44% said they had no trust at all in the organization, while another 23% said they had not a lot of trust. This bore out in a hypothetical election featuring Hamas, Fatah's current leader Mahmoud Abbas, yes they rhyme, and a former leader of Fatah's military wing who is currently in Israeli custody. Hamas only secured 24% of the support, which doubled Abbas's 12%, but fell notably short of the third alternative. There was also a large contingent of disaffected people who said that they would not participate at all. In any case, the party that was expelled from the Strip almost 2 decades earlier now combines for 44% of the hypothetical vote. The reasons that Abbas captures the smaller share are manifold, and none of this is particularly new. Going back to 2006, when Fatah lost by only a few points, exit polling showed that had Yasser Arafat still been alive, Fatah would have dominated the election. Things haven't exactly gotten better since then. Just shy of his 88th birthday, Abbas has a reputation of being out of touch, and makes the similar criticism of US politics look less egregious by comparison. He also has faced corruption allegations since first becoming president of the Palestinian Authority, and may be too moderate on positions with Israel for some Gazans' tastes. In that last respect, being in an Israeli jail for the last 2 decades lends inherent credibility to his tough on Israel credentials. Regardless of the internal breakdown within Fatah, that 24% is not a good place to be for Hamas. The low support had an obvious cause. Gazans do not believe that Hamas was doing a good job. Only 5% of Gazans reported not having problems with food availability. The GDP statistics highlight the underlying issue. Prior to the blockade, Gaza contributed about 34% of Palestinian GDP. Fast forward to today's post-blockade world, Gaza only contributes 18%. It is not as if Gaza's economy has completely disappeared, just that the West Bank, in the absence of a blockade, is doing better. You would think that the blockade would be the obvious thing that Gazans would blame for the predicament, but not so fast. 31% of those surveyed pointed the finger at Hamas. 26% said that it was inflation, though we should bear in mind that inflation is a government's macroeconomic problem. Only 16% pointed to the sanctions. Corruption appears to be a central issue. 34% felt that the amount of corruption within Hamas was large, while another 38% said medium. The political irony here is that, back in 2006, 78% expected corruption to decrease under Hamas's administration, and that was the top motivation among voters to put the party into office. Before analyzing what this means in the context of October 7th, a couple of quick caveats. First, Error Barometer only surveyed 399 people in Gaza. Now, that might sound like a tiny number, but fortunately we can all thank the statistics gods, for they are kind. Even with that small sample, the margin of error is only plus or minus 5%. So when 72% said that Hamas had medium or large corruption problems, the plausible range was between 67 and 77%. Either way, bad news if you're Hamas. The bigger issue, and the one that is perversely humorous, is biased sampling. Error Barometer conducted face-to-face surveys, which are expensive to run, but tend to be higher quality. However, you can only survey people who are around. If someone is too busy, you either cannot find them, or they will decline the request. If the busy people are systematically different from the non-busy people, your survey is less based and more biased. Now, what could make someone too busy to respond? Perhaps making final preparations for an attack? Israel claims that only 2,500 militants participated in it, which is about 0.1% of the Strip's total population. However, if Hamas loyalists were broadly helping out as well, then this could impart some small bias onto the poll. Ultimately, I would not be too concerned, but it is the strangest, funniest source of sample bias I have ever encountered. So what does this say about Hamas's motivation for October 7th? To be clear, the intelligence suggests that Hamas had been working on the plot for more than 2 years. But the final green light was not given until recently, and it is important to note that we do not observe the years-long plans that ultimately go into the shredder. That is a long way of saying that just because this plot was years in the making, does not mean that the current popularity problem does not explain it. Presumably, Hamas was aware that it was losing the support of its people. Members interact with regular Gazans on a daily basis, and they do not have the same level of social control of a country like North Korea, where everyone desperately tries to look like the greatest fan of the government, regardless of their true preferences. We do not know how worried the leadership of Hamas was about this. That is the million-dollar question that remains out there. To be a fly on the wall in the private meetings of top-level officials would make the job of a crisis analyst so much easier. But it is plausible that Hamas was worried. And it goes without saying that trying to distract from issues at home is a reason why wars are fought. We have covered it in a video before, and it even answers the inefficiency problem that our favorite lines on maps illustrate. But before we rush to any judgments, simply initiating a war does not magically solve the popularity problem. It turns out that Hamas was starting behind the 8 ball here. Before October 7th, 73% of Gazans said that they preferred peace with Israel. Now, public opinion polls on wars are always dicey. Look no further than the 74% of Americans that wanted to institute a no-fly zone over Ukraine back in February 2022. The average person does not have a good grasp on what happens after the first few dominoes fall. And you know what? I can't blame them. I myself am not an expert on, say, car engines, so I usually defer my judgment to mechanics to tell me what will happen if I do not make repairs. Similarly, that is why we have professionals who understand that, say, a no-fly zone would require killing Russian soldiers, which is a ticket to World War III. The point is that I would not bet that the percentage of Gazans that supported peace with Israel on October 6th matches the November 6th number, after Gazans see what happens. Or, more importantly for Hamas, that the popularity numbers will be identical either. Now, will they go up? That is central to the idea of provocation and overreaction, which we have explored earlier. It has happened for Hamas before, most recently following a 2021 conflict. However, usually when you try to create a rally round the flag effect, you do not want to make it seem like you started the conflict. Obviously, there is a long history between the two combatants, but that is still a tough narrative to sell to the average Gazan. Even so, if Israel is not careful, the response could polarize previously moderate Gazans into supporting Hamas. Of course, there is no guarantee that that will happen. But if Hamas is desperate for some reason, then it might be worth the risk for them. Sometimes you just have to pull the goalie. Right, gentlemen? Thank the nice gods that there are at least 6.9% of you guys that get what that means. In any case, if you want to learn more about the conflict, check out my playlist dedicated to it. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.